something has happened. A radical Marxist feminist historian from Harvard, her name is Elizabeth Fox Genovese, who was part of the 60s revolution. And this is what this historian says. Within a remarkably brief period has occurred a cataclysmic transformation of the very nature of our society. Isn't that interesting? This particular observer of the culture described what happened in the 60s as a cataclysmic transformation. In other words, what happened in the 60s is not the typical passing on of traditions from one generation to the next, which always occurs with some kind of conflict. This is special. Something strange happened. But what we must avoid, I think, in trying to come to grips with this, is nostalgia for the good old days, the pre-60s, the 50s, if you like. It's true that prior to the 60s, the West lived under what sociologists call the sacred canopy of a biblical worldview. People were not necessarily Christian, but their presuppositions about the nature of existence, what did it mean to be a male or a female, what was true or false, right or wrong, were defined by the biblical tradition from hundreds and hundreds of years of tradition. But now that canopy is being ripped away. It's never happened before in 1700 years. That's why I think the term cataclysmic transformation is appropriate. The plausibility structures that dominated the West when I came in '64 have been redefined really beyond recognition. God is now polytheism, many gods. Morality is relativism. It's certainly not Christian morality. Sexuality is omnigender. Gone is the simple heterosexual norm. Family is any combination of people and genders. Marriage is now extended to same-sex. Motherhood includes abortion on demand. Spirituality is do-it-yourself Eastern mysticism. Now, I watched this happen in the space of one generation. 3 years ago, I gave a lecture at the West Coast Ligonier Conference entitled The Gnostic Gospel. I had published a book, the title of which I'm very proud, The Gnostic Empire Strikes Back, in 1992. As when I came to the States, I went through culture shock. What I'd known in '64 was no longer clearly the case. Something was happening. And so I wrote that book, The Gnostic Empire Strikes Back, because I began to realize that what was happening was not really something new, but something old, represented as new. It was the old Gnosticism, but now supposedly in new dress. It was called the New Age movement. You remember Shirley MacLaine went on television and said, "I am God," in her book, Going Within. Well, you know, as soon as people claim to be God, you can tell that what is happening really is a fallback to paganism, which is another, well, Gnosticism is an expression of generalized paganism. And it brought me to the text of Scripture, which I'd read many times. Romans 1:25. They exchanged the truth of God for the lie. So here we have the identification of two kinds of truth. One is the truth. Worshipping and serving the creature rather than the Creator, who's blessed forever. Do you see that? A simple distinction that Paul gives us. He's telling us there are only two religions, right? I didn't invent this stuff. I wouldn't dare to. But Paul is actually saying here, when you look at it, there are only two ways of being a human being on this earth. You either worship the creation or you worship the Creator. I'd read that many times, but it suddenly hit me with this onrush in Christian America of Gnostic paganism that indeed Paul was right 2,000 years ago in what he said. And I tried to think of a way of describing it. You know, I used terms like Gnosticism, paganism, and then I came to see the term monism. But my wife, who's much more intelligent than I, said, why don't you just drop the M from monism, which means all is one, and everyone will understand. So I did. So we get the term oneism, you see, and that's paganism. Paganism is oneism. It's the worship of creation, where everything is one. Everything is of the same nature. Everything really shares the same substance. That's why the term one is used. And of course, that includes everything, rocks, trees, human beings, and God. God is included. It's wonderfully spiritual, by the way, but it actually reduces God to a piece of creation. You see what I mean? He's the spirit within things. The other I call twoism, because as Paul says, and if Paul is true, then what is true about existence is that there is creation, and then there's the creator who is radically different than creation. The watchmaker is different from a watch, right? You don't confuse them. And this is the case. God and creation are distinct, which means there are two kinds of existence, not one. Hence the term, you've got it, twoism. At the risk of being terribly oversimplified, I think that these terms help us look around and identify what's happening in our culture, even in the church. And as a matter of fact, we're used to thinking about that in spiritual terms, but really you have all kinds of oneisms. You have materialistic oneism, as in Marxism, as in atheism, because you see, in those systems that are not particularly spiritual, they still try to identify the world by the world itself with no reference to any power outside. So they are oneists as well. That's helpful. We need to see that there are two fundamental ideologies that I will show at the end of my lectures, possibly, are really the same because they're oneist, namely secular humanism and revived paganism. They're very different, but at the end of the day, they are, in their fundamental orientation to the world, oneists. This kind of thinking became more and more enamored of its own power and felt that it was the only way of relating to the world, that human reason was the source of truth. And belief in a world created by God and of reason created by God was dismissed as religious superstition and myth. And so for modern man, religion had to go. And of course, we saw this kind of thinking invade the church. That's what liberalism is, you see. Liberalism is the adaptation of the world's kind of thinking and trying to make it Christian. That's what liberals have done all through the ages, since the beginning of Christianity, beginning with the Gnostics, who were the original liberals who tried to take pagan notions of the mystery religions and make them Christian. So that's the mechanism that liberals use. And when I was studying New Testament at Harvard, of course, that was the great goal, to reinterpret the New Testament by demythologizing the supernatural. Demythologizing means taking away the myths and getting to the heart, which really, the heart was sort of a sense of one's own existential being faced with nothingness. That was the real meaning of Christianity in the New Testament. So there's no miracles and there's certainly no resurrection of Jesus. And then, of course, the mainline churches buy into this kind of thinking. But of course, someone has said, if you marry the spirit of the age, you will soon be a widower. And we've seen mainline churches going down. in their effect in our culture. And liberalism thus defined the gospel as mere social work and saw Jesus only as an example, not as a divine savior. That was myth, of course, you see, so myth had to go. The gospel was redefined in terms of Marxist politics. Liberation theology became all the rage, and Jesus was little more than a Che Guevara of 20th century revolutionary theory. On a different level, the secular humanists were greatly influenced by Darwin, who effectively eliminated belief in God the Creator and proposed in place of God the Creator the idea of an unguided and impersonal process of natural selection. Life came about by mere chance, and man was seen as the result of purposelessness and a mere natural process that did not have him in mind, by the way. So we are really the result of chance. It's incredible to see how far people can go with that as an explanation for the incredible beauty and power of what we represent as human beings. The way our bodies are put together, the way our minds can function. There's no valid explanation of this in secular humanism. And yet so many liberal thinkers adopted it. Science was the only way of knowing anything about anything. And so there was a belief that religion would disappear. When I came to the States in the 60s, I was asked to read books on the death of God. And this was all the rage. And we were told that this was the proof. And I was in an evangelical school, and I don't really blame my professors for seeing it this way. I saw it that way. That the death of God was the proof of the success of secular humanism. That man no longer needed God as a hypothesis. He was now fine on his own. The final triumph then of secular humanism is to declare in America in the 70s that God had died. Secular humanism had won. Now, in a certain sense, these predictions have come true. We're seeing the decline of the Christian faith in the population as a whole. No longer are many people influenced by a Christian way of thinking, and I don't think we should hide our eyes from that. And in that sense, we've seen a decline of attachment to the Christian faith. Now, this is a massive change. People no longer actually believe in God the Creator, and so they can do anything they want to. But that was not always the case. In 1890, the Supreme Court of the United States defined religion as one's view of one's relation to his Creator, to the obligations they impose of reverence for his being and character and obedience to his will. That was a statement of the Supreme Court in 1890. There was no other definition of God but of a personal, transcendent Creator. But thanks in many ways to secular humanism, this is no longer the case in public discourse. So what is secularism or secular humanism? Let me give you a simple definition. It comes in various names. As an intellectual discipline, it is known as philosophical materialism, that matter is ultimate. In the beginning was matter. That's the philosophy of materialism. As a religious expression, it is called atheism, the faith belief that there is no God. You can't prove that rationally, right? So an atheist has to be, in some sense, a religious believer. As a political form, it is practiced as Marxism and various forms of socialism. And for many people, it's simply a default way of thinking, of living without any notion that God exists. That's probably the way most people practice this kind of thinking. But in all these expressions of secularism, it's a consistent rejection as a mere ancient superstition, as sort of a holdover from the Middle Ages, and we must refuse that kind of mythology if we want to really do our world good. Now, this kind of a view still dominates the Western universities. Some of you young people that go to schools around here will confirm that your professors, many of them, believe in this kind of rationalism or secular humanism. However, this is not the whole story. Just as these philosophers of the 19th and early 20th century were predicting the end of the withering away of religion, in a kind of an ironic turn of events, we are now seeing the withering away of secular humanism. Did you realize that? You probably don't always see it, but this is happening, and many people are talking about it. And the withering away of secular humanism, oh, let me just say it. The proof is, how many people now say, I'm spiritual but not religious? In other words, they are making a claim to spirituality, which doesn't fit with secular humanism, right? That's superstition. Any kind of faith is superstition. Well, the reasons why this movement of secular humanism is on the decline, and indeed is withering away, is that while it was so optimistic and full of self-confidence, secular humanism produced two devastating world wars that produced the death of millions. In some of its socialistic expressions, it became totalitarian fascism, and some of its great leaders were Stalin, Hitler, and Pol Pot, that produced the murder of countless millions in the name of secular humanism. But there is another reason why secular humanism is in decline. It is severely weak as a philosophical system. What do I mean by that? Well, you see, to be a secular humanist, you have to believe in the validity of human reason. But in order to believe in human reason, you have to presuppose it. So to demonstrate that, you have to presuppose it. So it's a perfectly circular way of thinking. Does that make sense? In order to prove reason, you have to presuppose it. And to presuppose it, that's a faith statement. That the world is rational. You don't have all the information, right? You don't sit outside of the cosmos and look down and say, oh yeah, that's rational. You have to presuppose that. And some scholars have realized that this is not a ground for establishing secular humanism. The postmodern critique of secular humanism, which argued that all major ideas are simply human notions and they are not scientific or philosophical, included the critique of secular humanism, oddly. So postmodernism, the thinkers of whom were probably the sons and daughters of secular humanists, turns around and eats up their parents. There are two reasons really why secular humanism is on the decline. The first is it really cannot stand against true biblical theism. The conversion of Anthony Flew, the great atheist, is an example of that. He stated this: it is simply inconceivable that any material matrix or field can generate agents who think and act. Matter cannot produce conceptions and perceptions. Such a world has to originate in a living source, a mind. The greatest atheist of the 20th century finally has to admit that secularism cannot justify the human mind. Isn't that beautiful? But then, finally, there's a new way of thinking. The thinking of this new spirituality. David Miller, who was a professor at Syracuse University and was one of the Death of God theologians, actually said, At the death of God, you will see the rebirth of the gods and goddesses of ancient Greece and Rome. That's not secular humanism. That's a justification of a belief in all the gods. What did Miller know that we didn't know as we read him in the 70s? Well, he was a devout follower of Carl Jung, and that will be the subject of my next lecture. I ended the last lecture with some odd reference to a certain David Miller, who we all thought was a secular humanist because he was talking about the death of God. But it turns out that he actually, as I said, predicted that at the death of God, we would see the rebirth of the gods and goddesses of ancient Greece and Rome. That was odd. And I only recently discovered how this would happen. David Miller was a keen follower of the psychologist Carl Jung. He taught at Jungian clinics worldwide, at the Jung Institute in Switzerland, and at the Pacifica Graduate Institute in California, because he understood that what people were talking about, namely the death of God, was the death of the God of the Bible, not the notion of the death of God of divinity or of polytheism, which is precisely what he was predicting would come. That's just at the beginning in the 1970s that this was predicted. And I'd never ever thought of that in my life before, that that would be a possibility for Christian America. That's what he said. I'm interested in finding out how that came about, and especially for young people. How does this culture that you were born into come about? Is it just a neutral kind of event that takes place over which no one has control? Or is it actually the production of deliberate intentions of certain kinds of powerful people to make it happen? And I'm convinced that Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist, was essential in the production of our present culture, and I'd like to show you why. He, and along with his friend Mircea Eliade, and I've written those two names on the board, they were colleagues. Eliade was an expert in pagan religions, Jung a clinical psychologist. Together conspired to envision what they called a new humanism. The world of the early 20th century needed to focus on this new human that they would produce, based on pagan myths, oddly enough. Pagan myths have made an amazing comeback. In 1832, Charles Darwin, on his voyage, famous voyage to the Galapagos Islands, witnessed native aboriginals dancing themselves into a delirium, stark naked, and he was, he tells us, shocked. A most rude, barbarous scene, he says. That's Charles Darwin. How things have changed. Heathen and barbarian are politically incorrect terms anymore. And not far from where I live, in the Nevada desert, you can go to the Burning Man Festival, which draws 70,000 high-tech, modern young people, including Google founders Larry Page and Sergey Brin, and the CEO of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, to engage in pagan religion and sexual expressions of all kinds. People ride around on bicycles stark naked. This is called the Burning Man Festival that takes place every year. What a change between Darwin in 1832 and our present time in so-called Christian America. You know, many could be cited as influential in creating this modern-day culture. The Hindu mystic Swami Vivekananda, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi of the Beatles fame, Teilhard de Chardin. I'm just giving you the names. You will have to go and study these people. Teilhard de Chardin, the Roman Catholic evolutionary theologian. the Theosophists, Madame Blavatsky and Alice Bailey, the famous Marxist Frankfurt School, Betty Friedan, the radical feminist, Alfred Kinsey and Hugh Hefner, the popularizers of sexual liberation, and of course, Darwin, Marx, and Freud. However, in their case, being secular humanists, I don't think they count as much. And so I single out for a sort of emphasis Carl Jung and his friend Eliade. His dates are 1875 to 1961. He died right at the cusp of the 60s revolution. And Jung was driven by the idea that myth is the search to understand the self, and that all the gods are found within us, and that is the way to psychological health. That's the big change, folks. That all our fantasies within us actually give expression to the gods of the pagan myths throughout history, and that is the direction and source of psychological health. Jung was hailed, often by so-called liberal Christians, as the first Christian counselor because he turned away from Freud's secular humanism to emphasize spirituality. So he was seen as the great savior of the modern world. He was called the first Christian counselor. Jung's system of transpersonal psychology, that's the important name to retain, was not just for the psychologically sick, but a worldview to bring all of us to higher levels of personal liberation. Now, this transpersonal psychology was based on two things: his own experiences of the occult, and I will show you that this is the case, and two, on the recently made available pagan traditions, once considered barbarian. They were discovered in the 19th century, and actually Eliade produced a 19-volume encyclopedia of pagan traditions that we have in the library at Westminster Seminary. So what is going on here? What does Jung believe? The subconscious is guided by the pagan ideal of the, and you'll hear me say this a lot, of the joining of the opposites. This is fundamentally pagan. You remember I said in the first lecture, the two become one? That is to say, there is a joining of the two into one. Now that is called the joining of the opposites. A person gets in touch with his inner subconscious by joining together the inner contradictions within himself, and by meditating on the so-called pagan archetypes, these understandings of spirituality that you find in pagan religions. And in those pagan traditions, it is indeed the joining of the opposites that is the source of health. The ultimate goal of what Jung called individuation or maturity is the removal of the contradictions within us. Now, how do you do that? Well, you simply say that good and evil are merely perspectives of personal choice. Male and female are non-exclusive options for whatever fits your fantasy. This was being said at the beginning of the 20th century by the psychologist of the 20th century. You see, what we're seeing today is only the outworking of the theory. Such joining of the opposite heals guilt, eliminates notions of divine transcendence, the creator, and breaks the chains of heterosexual monogamous marriage. Jung proposed himself as an all-wise scientific expert of psychological health for the 20th century. But his own life included the rejection of marriage and the choice of fornication for the individuated, mature human being. Though he was accepted as a Christian, his father was a Lutheran minister, but his mother was a channeler. So that was quite an interfaith mix. Jung rejects the Christ of the Bible, preferring the Gnostic Christ. Here's where Jung's influence through Gnosticism in the 20th century is so important. He was one of the major influences to get people to take Gnosticism seriously, but he chooses over against Christ the Gnostic God. Now, who is the Gnostic God? His name is Abraxas, half man, half beast, a God that is higher than the Christian God and the devil and combines everything. That's what drove Jung in his theories. Now, the interesting thing is, in 1912, Jung began to meet the devil. Now, he doesn't quite say that, but he kept a journal which was called the Red Book, and it's only been made public a couple of years ago. I have it. It's this big and this thick. It's amazing, where he wrote all the intimate stuff of what he was doing. The Red Book. And in that, he describes frequent exercises in the emptying of consciousness to see what was beneath. And he talks about a spirit guide he had called Philemon, whom he described as an old man with horns and the wings of a bird, and as a pagan. This was his true inspiration, the spirit guide Philemon, who introduced him to Abraxas. I'm not making this up. This is in his Red Book that has now been published. Jung and Eliade saw themselves with these ideas as architects of a new humanism that would deliver the world from two blights. I find this very interesting in terms of what I was saying in the last lecture. The first blight, secular humanism. That is, intellectuals would open up their minds to the spiritual world, you see, that had been rejected along with Christianity. So delivering us from the blight of secular humanism, closed minds to this kind of reality, and of course, to the traditional religion of Christianity. Jung was able to penetrate the world of secular humanism, which is, of course, the high expression of our intellectual world in the day, by couching what he said in scientific language. So he was successful, you see, in proposing this view of psychology to lots of intellectual people because he used scientific language. But his whole attempt finally was an attack on Christianity. In this Red Book, he writes down his conversations that he had with himself, or his soul. His soul tells him the great work begins. You must go to a higher level of consciousness to no longer be a Christian. Jung asks, what is my calling? The soul replies, the new religion and its proclamation, a new ordering of human affairs. This is scary stuff, is it not? This is going on in Switzerland in some room somewhere, but it has immense implications for Western culture. He rejected Christianity. The Christ symbol lacks wholeness. We must beware, he said, of thinking of good and evil as absolute opposites. And he wanted to produce what he called a unitary world. This was Jung's goal. He had this goal of affecting the culture. He said we must infiltrate into people from many centers. But he realized how difficult this was because the West was under such an influence of Christian public morality. So he says, the ethical problem, I'm quoting here, the ethical problem of sexual freedom is really enormous and worth the sweat of all noble souls. But 2,000 years of Christianity can only be replaced by something equivalent, an irresistible mass movement. And of course, the irresistible mass movement was the liberation of sexuality to psychological and spiritual health. That's how he sold it. It wasn't just an apostasy from Christianity. It was actually the attempt to say, if you want to be healthy and even spiritual, you have to adopt this view of sexuality. Looking into the future some 70 years ago, he said this: I imagine a far finer and more comprehensive task for psychoanalysis. I think we must give it time to infiltrate into people from many centers, to revivify among intellectuals a feeling for myth and symbol, ever so gently to transform Christ back into the, listen to this, back into the soothsaying God of the Bible, which he was, and in this way absorb those ecstatic, instinctual forces of Christianity for the one purpose of making the cult and the sacred myth what they once were. What were they? A drunken feast of joy where man regained the ethos and holiness of an animal. That was his vision of the new Christianity. Well, how did he succeed? I've already sort of suggested. I think he succeeded because, in the first place, he proposed this radical way as a way for spiritual and psychological health. He produced a therapeutic mechanism for the individual subconscious to be liberated from the mental illness of guilt by joining or relativizing the opposites of right and wrong, male and female, etc. And you know today, when people do things, they say, well, it's my inner self that made me do it. And what do you say? There's nothing you can say when somebody says, I was a female yesterday, today I'm a male. It's my inner self that now is authority for everything I do and what you should accept. I think Jung has succeeded by this technique, you see, of getting people to believe that what their unconscious fantasy tells them is true. And we're building a world on that basis. I don't think we can understand the power of pornography without seeing that. I was reading a book on the plane yesterday. The power of pornography in this world, especially in men, is incomprehensible. You ladies have no idea. But I think that it all comes from this appeal to the inner self, you see, to be the authority of what is true and to allow our inner fantasies to establish. And of course, if you make reference to the pagan myths, they're all fantasies, you see, that is the source of spiritual strength. He got great help from Christian liberals who bought into the system, probably some ignorantly, not realizing how deep this was, because you see, all this occult stuff never came out till 2 or 3 years ago. And he died in 1961. So his system, as a scientific system, was being employed and then being used in the liberal churches. He also, as I indicated earlier, was very much involved in the promotion of the Gnostic texts. Indeed, one collection of the Gnostic texts is called the Jung Codex. So Jung was very definitely involved in the pushing of Gnosticism. And then the linguistic subterfuge. One of his biographers is a very brilliant Harvard researcher, not at all a Christian, who began to put together this stuff before he'd ever seen the Red Book. He put together this stuff, and he was rejected by so many people in this Jungian movement as a rabble-rouser with no evidence. When the Red Book came out, of course, he was justified. But he noted even then that Jung was using a subterfuge, namely using various types of language from the language of high scientific terminology acceptable to scholars, the terms more at home in psychic spiritual initiation with his inner circle. Jung, says this biographer Richard Knoll, was careful to always speak and write in code. However, some of his close disciples recognized the truth of this. One of his close disciples, June Singer, noted that Jung had two personalities. One, the rational and scientific. Two, the one that made him really great, the transpersonal one. She says Jung had more than a little interest in the occult. Jung himself said, I quote, that his work did not finally allow for scientific proof because it was beyond science. So he said of what he wrote in the Red Book, these experiences represent the most important time of my life. Everything later was merely the outer classification for scientific elaboration and the integration into life. So it was these experiences, Philemon with the occult, that he himself said was the most important of anything he'd done. And then, of course, Jung was well financed. Some of the wealthy Western families, like the Rockefellers, the McCormicks, and the Mellons, financed Jung and his ideas throughout the West. It seems that the time was right for such a spirituality, as the culture was losing its faith in secular humanism. Jung, you see, was able to see that what was happening here, a need for an attachment to something deeper than the merely material, was being expressed. And he said, nothing matters but the completion of the self. Jung died in 1961, but his inspiration lived on in the 60s mantra, if it feels good, just do it. Free love will save the world. Where did they get that? It just happened? Or was it already being introduced via this theory of the human being that Jung had proposed? I love this conclusion of Jung's biographer, this Richard Noel, who's not a Christian. Sensing the vast achievement of Jung, he sought to find a figure in history whose influence would correspond with the importance of Jung. Here's what he said. Listen carefully. I have come to the conclusion that as an individual, Jung ranks with the Roman Emperor Julian the Apostate as the one who significantly undermined Orthodox Christianity and restored polytheism to the Hellenistic world of Western civilization. You know who Julian was? He was the nephew of Constantine, raised a Christian, but he determined when he became emperor to turn that empire back to the worship of Isis, the goddess. What an incredibly powerful image to carry with us of what Jung did. But here's what Noel says. For a variety of historical technical factors, modern mass media being the most important, and I love this phrase, Jung has succeeded where Julian failed. Jung succeeded with... Julian said, you have conquered Galilean on his deathbed. He couldn't do it. Jung has succeeded where Julian failed. The result is that the patriarchal monotheism of the Orthodox I'm still citing Noel, of the Orthodox Judeo-Christian faiths has all but collapsed. And filling the void, we find Protestants, Catholics, Jews adopting alternative syncretistic belief systems that often belie a basis in Jungian psychological theories. I think it's important to realize the power of this notion for changing the way people put their lives together. Thank you. Quote, an emerging American wisdom tradition that will save humanity. So this is an American tradition. Now, the seduction of a pagan worldview is not new. Cultural Observer remarked about ancient pagan Babylon. The Babylonians made pagan religions fashionable. They incorporated art, drama, and music into religion until the pagan ideas were attractively represented as the highest expressions of their culture. We have heard often of the glory of imperial Rome. There is a certain attractiveness to the pagan worldview. So it's not a question just of individuals having experiences of themselves as divine, but individuals now attempting to rethink the whole of reality for the sake of the planet. Now, there's nothing wrong with the environment and being concerned about it, but this man showing how much young people are attracted and seduced by this vision of saving the planet, and rightly so. But this man Hawken actually, shows that it is motivated by a certain kind of spirituality, which is the key issue that we need to define. It's not just any spirituality, and here's how he describes it. It is indigenous culture and native spiritual practices, plus Buddhist ideas that eliminate the concept of an external divine authority and rigid categories. Did you follow that? In other words, Native American spirituality plus Eastern mysticism all rolled together to get rid of the notion of God as an external authority. And this vision is being introduced on many campuses via the notion of sustainability. And of course, it's not just environmental sustainability either. It's that we all need to be one and include everybody, and then we can sustain ourselves. So all the radical sexual agendas are included in the notion of sustainability are interesting. And there is, in fact, a White House initiative called the Interfaith Youth Corps, which asks, what if campuses led the movement for interfaith cooperation? You see, this becomes the cutting edge for the kids. It's to adopt this notion of planetary salvation via interfaith thinking. Now, is this just my idea? I always like to find scholars who agree with me, because I'm afraid of my own ideas. And I found an article by a non-religious sociologist by the name of Ernest Sternberg with the title, Purifying the World, What the New Radical Ideology Stands For. He is a specialist in urban planning at the University of Buffalo. And he identifies a powerful group of people, and it's a wonderful title, whom he names world purificationists. Isn't that an interesting term? This is a secular man, he's not at all religious, but he looks at this progressive movement and calls it world purificationism. He examines the sociological and political aspects of what he sees as a powerful world-transforming movement. Here's what he says. We are in the midst of a worldwide rise of well, this is his view, of a non-religious apocalyptic movement preaching global human renewal and predicting apocalypse as its woeful alternative. In other words, if we don't follow the movement, the whole will implode. According to Sternberg, this world purificationism is made up by a vast alliance of social movements that look for a new era of social justice. It includes all the modern notions of civil rights and a sustainable development in which it is believed all diverse cultures will meet in harmony on the earth. There is one enemy, and it's the past Western civilization. He doesn't use the term, but it's obviously the past Christendom that is identified as the enemy. Now, I'm impressed by this support of what I'm saying because it doesn't come from some kind of right-wing sensationalist, but a very careful intellectual sociologist who sees this massive movement taking shape. But actually, I feel like he fails to see the real power of the movement by not seeing two things: the spirituality of this movement and its view of sexuality. The two most important factors, I think, that motivate the human being, he doesn't see. But when you add those two elements, you begin to understand how powerful this movement is. Mike King, a research fellow at London Metropolitan University, published a book, in 2009, entitled Post-Secularism, The Hidden Challenge to Extremism. And what he means by that is that this is a very balanced movement. It's not an extremist movement. It rejects two ways of thinking that we've seen in the past. One is the Christian faith, that's extremist. And the other is atheism, that's extremist too. So intellectuals are invited now to join this wonderfully balanced view of things, where you can actually be an intellectual and be spiritual at the same time. I think that's somewhat like the future we're looking at. Not that the spiritualists are these weird groups at the edges of society belonging to these strange cults like the Hermetic Order and some of the stuff we talked about yesterday, but actually that this is how intellectuals must think about existence from now on. Carl Jung then becomes the model. And we see here perhaps some of the contours of this new human embracing the occult as a scientific truth. You get that? The occult can be defended now by intellectual scientific inquiry. You remember what I cited about Jung, that he himself agreed that his work was really extra scientific. It did not allow for scientific proof. It was beyond science. But what he learned in his room, in his meeting with Philemon, this deep occultic experience was the most, I'll quote him, the most important time of my life. Everything later was merely outer classification. So here we have Jung, you see, functioning now as the model of the intellectual of the future. Spirituality has become absolutely essential, you see. Secular humanism has let us all down, so rejecting that extreme position. But then the other extreme position of Christianity must go. So here you find yourself in the middle, you see, with an intelligent way of taking on the future and its spiritual aspects. Then the new science is evoked, quantum physics, with its notion of the subatomic world of quantum indeterminacy, is suggesting this kind of oneness spirituality. Transhumanism, which is now being proposed as the next phase of evolution, where we move from the human to the transhuman with the aid of the machine, which really is man saving man, which is a perfectly onist solution. King also talks about the recovered nature spirituality, that we scientists need to see that nature is really spiritual, that Mother Earth is alive and well. And then modern feminism, which has discovered that the goddess was the one in power at the time of the Bible, and this puts an end to the patriarchal god Yahweh and leaves him a place of relative unimportance. And so this post-secular age, you see, is now excited about the future in terms of what it will bring to intellectuals who want to be spiritual. I mentioned Richard Tarnas, a brilliant pagan philosopher who wrote the book The Passion of the Western Mind. And he believes we have reached a pivotal breaking point. The future of the human spirit now hangs in the balance. And he believes that the human story is culminating in a great synthesis, bringing the two tendencies of Western history, the autonomous mind of the scientist and the wild spirit of the romantics. He calls them romantics, we would call them occultists. And here's what he says. It's a big, thick book. It's actually read in most of the philosophy departments in America, as a matter of fact. This is a thoroughgoing man committed to the occult. But he's so brilliant that his work is indeed read everywhere. And here's the interesting statement. At the end of this, I think it's 500 pages, the deepest passion of the Western mind, and he'd gone through the whole history of the West, has been to reunite with the ground of its being, that is, Mother Nature. So this long process of the Western mind and its affirmation of its autonomy now unites with Mother Nature, nature as divine. So this is the ultimate union of the rational with the mythical, the normal with the paranormal, the material with the immaterial, the divine with the human. The CEO and chairman of Apple Computer, John Sculley, believes that Tarnas's work is powerful and will serve us well into the next millennium. So you see, these folks are enthused by this. And it's coming about because atheism and this new spirituality really share some fundamental things together. We shouldn't be surprised. I end with this sad statement that I read in the Daily Telegraph in 2012. Britain will miss Christianity when it's gone. So will America. In eschatology, we're losing the binary of the ultimate distinction of heaven and hell. Sinners in the hands of an angry God is a joke for the modern mind. Alas, when you get rid of that, though, there is no ultimate justice, no final accountability with regard to real evil. Can you see what that does? Hitler is in heaven. He was not guilty of crimes, but of mistakes. And so the very nature of the judgments that God alone can use are eliminated with the rejection of heaven and hell. Obviously, the rejection of the binary of sexuality and gender leads the dance as we see the attack upon gender. In Sweden, they now develop gender-neutral pronouns because we can't stand affirming male or female. I mentioned earlier, M and F is disappearing from official documents. A New York Times article in 2012 entitled, "Can a Boy Wear a Skirt to School?" And this was proposed as a forward-looking cohort of the population for whom gender fluidity is a creative playing field. You see, the rising generation has been so brainwashed into thinking that gender distinctions have to go. That's the future. And the theological basis, of course, is the joining of the opposites, which is essential to a pagan worldview of oneism. Our world is very similar to that of Paul's time, and we have to face the reality that perhaps what reigned in Rome is coming back. Isaiah said of apostate Israel, "Justice is turned back, and righteousness stands far away. For truth has stumbled in the public squares, and uprightness cannot enter. Truth is lacking, and he who departs from evil makes himself a prey." The Apostle Paul concludes, as he looks at the Roman Empire, "For this reason God gave them over to dishonorable passions and to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done." Is our culture at this stage, the stage of being given over?